People only notice a man when he still has something left to lose. That was the sentence Daniel Mercer used to repeat to himself every winter morning while the cold wind rolled across the empty parking lot behind the gas station outside Flagstaff, Arizona. But on the morning everything changed, he realized the world had stopped noticing him a long time ago. The October sky hung low with dark gray clouds, and the sharp mountain air cut through the holes in his old denim jacket as he sat beside a rusted shopping cart filled with the last pieces of a life that no longer looked like it belonged to anyone. A stained blanket, 2 paperbacks with torn covers, a cracked thermos that barely kept coffee warm. At 58 years old, Daniel had learned how invisible a man could become in America once people stopped expecting anything from him. Cars rolled past him every day without slowing down. Tourists hurried into the convenience store without making eye contact. And even the employees had stopped asking him to move because eventually they realized he never caused trouble. He simply existed in the background like an old highway sign people forgot how to read. Daniel rubbed his stiff hands together and stared toward Interstate 40 while 18-wheelers thundered through the freezing air, their headlights glowing faintly through the fog creeping across the highway. He had once driven roads like these for years, back when his wedding ring still sat on his finger, and his daughter Emma used to call him every Sunday afternoon just to hear his voice. But divorce papers, missed opportunities, medical bills, and too many lonely nights had a way of turning decades into dust before a man even understood what was happening. A cold gust swept across the parking lot, and Daniel lowered his head, preparing himself for another silent morning, until he heard something unusual between the sound of engines and rattling shopping carts. A dog barked once. Short, sharp, desperate. Daniel slowly looked toward the edge of the road near a patch of frozen weeds beside the highway fence. And there, standing completely still beneath the pale gray sky, was a German shepherd with thick, black and tan fur covered in dirt and melting frost. The dog wasn't growling, wasn't begging, wasn't running around like a stray searching for scraps. It was simply staring directly at him. Daniel narrowed his tired blue eyes and let out a slow breath as the animal took one cautious step forward. There was something strange about the way the dog carried itself, something disciplined and painfully calm, almost like it had spent days searching for exactly one person and had finally found him. The shepherd's ribs showed faintly beneath its coat, and one of its paws lifted slightly off the frozen pavement as if it had been injured, but the animal never broke eye contact. Daniel looked behind himself to see if maybe the dog belonged to someone else nearby, but the parking lot remained empty except for the distant hum of traffic and the flickering neon sign above the gas station diner. Then the dog began walking toward him slowly, carefully, through the freezing wind, until it stopped only a few feet away beside the shopping cart. For several seconds neither of them moved. Daniel could see the animal trembling from the cold, yet the shepherd still sat down quietly beside him, as if this decision had already been made long before that morning. Daniel swallowed hard and stared at the dog's tired amber eyes, and for the first time in months, maybe years, something unfamiliar pushed against the emptiness inside his chest. Not hope, not happiness, just the strange feeling that maybe the world had not completely forgotten both of them yet. Daniel stared at the German shepherd for several long seconds, while freezing wind swept loose paper across the cracked pavement behind the gas station diner. And the longer he looked at the dog, the more unsettled he became by the strange intelligence in its eyes. Most stray dogs either approached people desperately or stayed away completely, but this animal did neither. It sat beside him calmly, breathing slowly, watching him with the kind of patience that made Daniel feel as though the shepherd already understood more about him than most people ever had. "You lost, buddy?" Daniel finally asked in a rough voice weakened by cold mornings. And too many years talking mostly to himself. The dog tilted its head slightly, but did not move. Daniel glanced around the nearly empty lot again, hoping someone would come running out yelling that their dog had escaped, but nobody appeared. A battered pickup truck pulled up to the gas pumps, and 2 tourists stepped out wearing expensive winter jackets without paying the slightest attention to the man sitting beside the shopping cart or the large German shepherd at his feet. Daniel gave a tired smile under his gray beard. "Guess that makes 2 of us." The shepherd slowly lowered itself onto the cold concrete beside him as though it had accepted the invitation to stay. Daniel noticed then that the dog's front paw looked swollen, not badly injured, but sore enough to make each movement cautious. The old instinct buried deep inside him stirred immediately. Years ago, before life had fallen apart piece by piece, Daniel had spent weekends hiking with his daughter through trails outside Denver, and Emma had always stopped to help injured animals no matter how small the problem was. She once cried for an hour after finding a bird with a damaged wing near their apartment complex. Daniel still remembered carrying the bird home wrapped carefully in one of Emma's sweaters while she smiled beside him like he had rescued the entire world. The memory hit him harder than he expected. He quickly looked away from the dog and rubbed his hands over his face. "You picked the wrong guy," he muttered quietly. "I can barely take care of myself." The shepherd remained beside him anyway. Minutes passed while traffic roared along Interstate 40 and the smell of gasoline mixed with cold mountain air. Finally, Daniel reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out half of a beef sandwich wrapped in a napkin from the night before. It was the last real food he had until he could figure out what to do later that evening. But after hesitating only briefly, he tore the sandwich in half and placed one piece carefully on the pavement. The dog did not lunge for it, did not snatch it greedily like most hungry strays would. Instead, the shepherd looked at Daniel first, almost cautiously, before gently taking the food from the ground. Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "Somebody trained you well." The dog ate slowly, then settled back beside him again, pressing lightly against the side of Daniel's leg for warmth. The contact was small, barely noticeable, but something about it cracked open a quiet ache inside him that he had spent years trying to ignore. For the first time in months, Daniel realized the silence around him no longer felt completely empty, and somewhere beyond the gray clouds hanging over northern Arizona, snow began drifting softly across the highway. Snow continued falling lightly over Flagstaff as evening settled across the highway, turning the gas station lights into pale yellow smears against the darkening sky, while Daniel Mercer sat beneath the side awning with the German shepherd curled quietly beside him. The temperature had already dropped below freezing, and every passing truck carried another wave of icy wine through the parking lot. Daniel pulled the old blanket tighter around his shoulders and looked down at the dog, who had not left his side once during the entire afternoon. A small part of him kept expecting the animal to suddenly run away toward some unseen owner, but the shepherd remained there with calm loyalty, watching every passing car as though standing guard beside him. "You really do not have anywhere else to go, do you?" Daniel whispered. The dog lifted its head slightly at the sound of his voice. Up close, Daniel could see faint gray around the animal's muzzle, signs that the shepherd was no longer young either. There was exhaustion in those amber eyes, but also discipline, patience, and something deeper that Daniel could not explain. It reminded him of soldiers he used to meet years ago during long freight deliveries near military bases across the Southwest. Men who carried quiet pain without talking about it. Men who had learned how to survive by staying silent. The diner door opened behind him, and warm light spilled briefly across the pavement as Maria, one of the late-night waitresses, stepped outside carrying a trash bag. She stopped when she noticed the dog beside Daniel. "That yours?" she asked. Carefully, Daniel shook his head. "Not exactly." Maria studied the shepherd for a moment before softening slightly. "Animal control came through yesterday looking for a missing German shepherd. Family from Sedona, I think." Daniel looked down at the dog again, but something about the idea felt wrong immediately. This animal did not look lost anymore. If anything, it looked like it had already decided exactly where it belonged. Maria tossed the trash into the dumpster and glanced back toward the diner windows fogged with warmth and coffee steam. "Supposed to get down to 22 tonight," she said quietly. "You should not stay out here." Daniel gave the same tired smile he always used whenever someone said something they both knew could not change anything. "Not many options." Maria hesitated for a second before reaching into her apron pocket and pulling out a foil-wrapped bundle. "Turkey sandwich." Kitchen was going to throw it away. Daniel accepted it carefully. "Thank you." She nodded toward the dog. "Looks like he already picked you." Then she disappeared back inside before Daniel could answer. Snowflakes drifted across the parking lot in silence, while Daniel unwrapped the sandwich and split it evenly between himself and the shepherd. Again, the dog waited patiently until Daniel took the first bite before eating its own portion. The simple gesture hit Daniel harder than he expected. Respect. Trust. Manners. Somebody had loved this dog once. Somebody had trained him to stay calm, stay close, and never take food before permission. Daniel swallowed slowly as old memories surfaced again without warning. Emma teaching their golden retriever to sit in the tiny backyard behind their Denver apartment. Her laughter during summer evenings. The sound of a screen door slamming shut while sunlight poured across the grass. For years, Daniel had tried not to think about those memories because every good memory eventually led to the same emptiness afterward. But tonight, sitting beside the German Shepherd while snow covered the frozen highway, those memories no longer felt painful in the same way. They felt distant, fragile, like pieces of another man's life slowly finding their way back to him through the cold. The snowstorm grew heavier after midnight, covering the edges of the highway in white while the temperature continued dropping across northern Arizona, and Daniel Mercer realized the old blanket would not be enough to keep either of them warm until morning. He sat with his back against the cold brick wall beside the diner, while the German Shepherd remained pressed against his side, sharing what little body heat it could. Every few minutes the dog lifted its head toward the highway, as if listening carefully to distant sounds hidden beneath the wind. Daniel could not remember the last time another living thing had stayed this close to him without asking for something in return. Around 1 o'clock, the diner finally closed for the night. Lights inside disappeared one by one until only the buzzing gas station sign illuminated the empty parking lot. Maria stepped outside wearing a thick winter coat and spotted Daniel immediately. Her expression tightened when she saw snow gathering across his shoulders. "You are still here?" she asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "Looks that way." She stared at the shepherd curled beside him. "Dog still has not left either." Daniel looked down at the animal and gently scratched behind its ears for the first time. The shepherd leaned slightly into his hand, but remained calm and quiet. "Guess we are both stubborn." Maria hesitated before speaking again. "There is an old storage shed behind the diner. It is not much, but it blocks the wind. My manager would probably complain if he knew, so do not tell anyone I mentioned it." Daniel blinked in surprise. "You sure? Nobody should freeze out here tonight." She pointed toward the back alley beside the building. "The side door sticks a little, but it opens." Daniel thanked her quietly, then slowly pushed himself to his feet while stiffness shot through his knees and lower back. The German Shepherd stood immediately beside him, limping only slightly on the swollen paw. Together they walked through the swirling snow behind the diner until Daniel found the small storage shed tucked beside a chain-link fence. The rusty door groaned loudly when he pulled it open, revealing stacks of old cardboard boxes, broken shelves, and the smell of dust mixed with motor oil, but compared to the freezing wind outside, it felt almost comfortable. Daniel spread his blanket carefully across the driest corner of the concrete floor and sat down heavily while the shepherd circled once before lying beside him. For a while neither of them moved. Snow tapped softly against the metal roof overhead while distant truck engines echoed across the interstate. Daniel stared into the darkness and felt exhaustion settle deep into his bones. "You know," he said quietly after several minutes, "I used to think losing everything happened all at once, like some kind of disaster. But it does not. It happens slowly. One missed phone call, one bad year, one person who stops waiting for you to get better." The shepherd lifted its head slightly, listening. Daniel let out a tired breath and rubbed his eyes. "My daughter probably thinks I disappeared on purpose." The words came out rougher than he intended. He had not spoken about Emma out loud in almost a year. There had been birthdays he missed, messages he never answered, and too much shame building up over time until calling her felt impossible. Daniel looked toward the dog again and gave a weak smile. "Funny thing is, you are the first good listener I have met in a long time." The shepherd slowly rested its head across Daniel's leg, warm and steady despite the freezing night outside. Daniel froze for a moment, surprised by the quiet trust in the gesture. Then, without thinking about pride or loneliness or the years he had wasted hiding from the world, he rested his trembling hand gently over the dog's thick fur and closed his eyes while snow continued falling across the silent Arizona highway. Daniel Mercer woke before sunrise to the sound of scratching against the metal door of the storage shed and the distant groan of truck engines rolling across Interstate 40. For a few confused seconds he forgot where he was, but then he felt the steady warmth pressed against his side and looked down to see the German shepherd already awake, ears alert, watching the narrow crack beneath the door where pale morning light pushed through the snow outside. The freezing air inside the shed smelled faintly of wet cardboard and gasoline. Yet somehow Daniel had slept more peacefully than he had in months. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the simple comfort of not feeling completely alone through the night. He slowly sat up, joints aching from the cold concrete floor, and noticed the dog immediately stand beside him. "Morning to you too," Daniel muttered with a tired smile. When he opened the shed door, sharp winter air rushed inside, while fresh snow crunched beneath his worn boots. Nearly 4 inches had fallen overnight, coating the parking lot, the highway signs, and the pine trees along the distant hills in soft white silence. The shepherd stepped carefully outside beside him, lifting the sore paw slightly, but moving better than the day before. Daniel looked down at the animal and shook his head. "You need a name if you are planning to keep following me around." The dog stared back calmly. Daniel glanced toward the interstate, thinking for a moment. "What about Scout?" The shepherd tilted its head slightly at the word, and Daniel let out a quiet laugh that fogged into the freezing air. "Guess that means yes." For the first time in longer than he could remember, the sound of his own laughter did not feel forced. They walked slowly toward the diner together while morning traffic began filling the highway again. A few drivers glanced curiously at the older man and the large German shepherd moving side by side through the snow, but Daniel noticed something strange almost immediately. People looked at him differently when the dog was there. Not with pity, not with suspicion. Somehow the shepherd's calm presence made him visible again in a way he could not explain. Inside the diner, warmth and the smell of coffee wrapped around them instantly. Maria stood behind the counter pouring refills for 2 truckers and smiled faintly when she spotted Scout walking beside Daniel. "Looks like you found yourself a partner," she said. Daniel shrugged lightly. "Feels more like he found me." One of the truckers near the window leaned forward to pet the shepherd, but Scout remained pressed, quietly beside Daniel's leg, watching the stranger carefully without aggression. "Beautiful dog," the trucker said. "Military trained maybe." Daniel looked down at Scout again. The calm discipline, the steady focus, the way he constantly scanned doors and movement around the room. The thought had crossed Daniel's mind more than once already. Maria placed a hot coffee and 2 strips of bacon on the counter without asking for payment. "For both of you," she said softly. Daniel hesitated. "I cannot pay for this." "I did not ask you to." He swallowed hard before nodding his thanks. Scout waited patiently until Daniel offered the bacon piece by piece. Watching the shepherd eat carefully beside the counter stirred something unfamiliar inside the diner. People smiled. One older woman near the register even asked if she could take a picture of the dog. Daniel found himself answering questions, making small conversation, speaking more words in 20 minutes than he usually did in an entire week. And while snow continued drifting softly beyond the windows, Daniel slowly began realizing that the shepherd had not only appeared beside him on the coldest night of the year. Somehow, without either of them understanding how, Scout had already started leading him back toward the world he thought he had lost forever. By late afternoon, the storm had finally passed, leaving the mountains around Flagstaff covered in bright white snow beneath a cold blue Arizona sky. And for the first time in days, sunlight touched the parking lot outside the diner. Daniel Mercer sat near the edge of the building with Scout resting beside him while long-haul trucks rolled steadily along Interstate 40. The warmth of the sun against his face felt unfamiliar after so many freezing nights, and he caught himself almost relaxing before reality slowly settled back into place. He still had no home, no savings, no real plan beyond surviving another day. Yet somehow the weight of those truths no longer crushed him the way they used to. Scout shifted slightly beside him, ears lifting toward the sound of a pickup truck pulling into the gas station. A middle-aged man wearing a brown work jacket stepped out, carrying a toolbox, and paused when he noticed the German shepherd. "That your dog?" he asked. Daniel glanced down at Scout before answering carefully. "Looks like he decided to be." The man smiled faintly. "Beautiful shepherd. Had one growing up in New Mexico. Smartest dog I ever knew." Scout remained calm but alert while the stranger crouched a few feet away, respecting the distance. "Name is Hank," the man said, extending a hand toward Daniel instead. Daniel hesitated briefly before shaking it. Human contact still felt strange after spending so much time isolated from everyone around him. Hank nodded toward the shopping cart near the wall. You looking for work at all? Daniel blinked in surprise. Work? My brother owns a small auto shop about 15 miles west of here. One of his mechanics quit last week. Nothing fancy. Mostly cleaning bays, moving parts around, basic maintenance. But he pays cash every Friday. Daniel stared at him silently for a moment. It had been nearly 2 years since anyone offered him an actual opportunity instead of pity. I have not worked in a while, Daniel admitted quietly. Hank shrugged. Most people around here have rough seasons. Does not mean they stop being useful. The words landed harder than Hank probably realized. Daniel looked away toward the highway while old shame tightened inside his chest. There had been a time when he worked 60 hours a week without complaint, when he carried photographs of Emma inside his wallet and promised himself she would never see him fail. But somewhere along the road, he stopped believing he deserved another chance. Scout suddenly stood and moved closer against Daniel's side, pressing gently against his leg as if sensing the shift in his mood. Hank noticed it immediately and smiled. Dog already trusts you. That says something. After the truck pulled away, Daniel sat in silence for several minutes while cold wind drifted across the snow-covered parking lot. Work. The word echoed strangely in his mind. A routine. A paycheck. Somewhere to be in the morning besides a diner parking lot. It felt dangerously close to hope, and hope frightened him more than disappointment ever had. Because disappointment only hurt once. Hope could destroy a man slowly if life took it away again. Daniel rubbed his rough hands together and looked down at Scout. You think I can still do something useful? The shepherd stared back steadily, amber eyes calm beneath the fading afternoon light. Then Scout stood, turned toward the highway, and began walking a few steps ahead before stopping to look back at him. Daniel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like laughter. Yeah, he muttered while pushing himself slowly to his feet. I guess sitting still has not worked out too well for either of us. Together, they started walking across the snowy parking lot, while the evening sun stretched long shadows across the frozen Arizona ground. And somewhere deep inside Daniel Mercer, something that had been asleep for years quietly began waking up again. The next morning arrived clear and painfully cold, with thin sunlight stretching across the snow-covered roads outside Flagstaff, while Daniel Mercer stood beside the gas station sink, splashing icy water across his face. His reflection in the cracked mirror barely looked familiar anymore. Deep lines cut across his weathered face, gray filled his beard unevenly, and exhaustion sat permanently behind his pale blue eyes. But for the first time in years, he noticed something else staring back at him too. Alertness. A reason to stand up before sunrise. Scout waited patiently outside the restroom door, watching passing cars with calm focus while steam drifted from the nearby diner vents into the freezing morning air. Daniel stepped back outside and rubbed warmth into his hands. Well, partner, he said quietly. Guess we find out if I still remember how to work. The auto shop Hank mentioned sat along a quiet frontage road west of town beside an old tire warehouse and a faded sign that read Walker Auto Repair. Snow covered the edges of the parking lot when Daniel and Scout finally arrived after nearly an hour walking through the cold. Daniel stopped outside the garage entrance, suddenly unsure of himself. Through the open bay doors, he could hear country music playing softly beneath the sound of air tools and engines. Men moved confidently around lifted trucks while warm air carrying the smell of motor oil drifted into the freezing street. It felt like another world entirely. A world Daniel used to belong to before life slowly pushed him out of it. Scout sat beside him quietly, sensing his hesitation. Daniel swallowed hard. Maybe this was a bad idea. The shepherd looked up at him steadily, without moving. Somehow that calm gaze made turning around feel impossible. Before Daniel could second-guess himself again, a tall man wearing grease-stained coveralls stepped out of the garage, wiping his hands with a rag. You Daniel? He asked. Daniel nodded carefully. Hank said you might need help. The man studied him for a moment before glancing toward Scout. That the shepherd he told me about? Daniel nodded again. Name is Scout. A faint smile crossed the mechanic's face. I am Frank Walker. He crouched slightly toward the dog, but Scout remained close beside Daniel instead of approaching. Protective, Frank said. Good trait. Daniel shifted awkwardly beneath the man's calm attention. He expected questions about where he lived, or why his clothes looked worn, or how long he had been struggling. But Frank simply nodded toward the garage. You know how to sweep floors and organize tools. Daniel almost laughed at the simplicity of the question. Yeah, I think I can handle that. Then you can start today. The words hit Daniel with surprising force. No forms. No judgment. No long explanation about his past failures. Just a simple opportunity handed to him without humiliation. Inside the garage, warmth wrapped around him immediately while engines rumbled across the concrete floor. Scout stayed close beside Daniel as mechanics glanced curiously toward the large German shepherd walking calmly through the shop. One younger employee grinned. That dog better at repairs than the last guy? Even Daniel smiled slightly at that. Frank handed him a broom and pointed toward stacks of tires near the back wall. You work hard, you eat lunch with us. Daniel stared down at the broom in his hands for a second longer than necessary. Such a small thing should not have mattered this much, but after years of feeling discarded by the world, being trusted with even basic work felt almost overwhelming. Scout settled near the toolbox against the wall while Daniel slowly began sweeping melted snow, dirt, and gravel across the concrete floor. And as sunlight poured through the garage windows onto the drifting dust beneath his boots, Daniel Mercer realized this was the first morning in a very long time that he no longer felt invisible. By the end of the first week at Walker Auto Repair, Daniel Mercer could already feel the difference in his body. His hands still ached from cold mornings and years of hard living, but now the soreness came from work instead of survival. Each morning before sunrise, he walked to the garage beside Scout, while the streets of Flagstaff slowly woke beneath pale winter light. And every day the German shepherd waited quietly near the back office, while Daniel swept floors, organized parts, cleaned tools, and occasionally helped with simple repairs when the mechanics fell behind. Nobody treated him like a burden. Nobody looked through him anymore. Frank Walker paid him cash every Friday afternoon exactly as promised, folding the bills carefully into Daniel's hand, without ceremony or pity. The first time it happened, Daniel stared at the money for several silent seconds before slipping it into his jacket pocket. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to earn something honestly again. Scout adapted to the garage routine faster than anyone expected. Customers often stopped just to pet him, and even the mechanics who originally joked about having a dog around began keeping scraps of bacon or pieces of jerky in their lunchboxes for him. Yet despite all the attention, Scout never wandered far from Daniel. Wherever Daniel moved, the shepherd quietly followed. It became so natural that eventually nobody questioned it anymore. Late one afternoon, while snow melted slowly off the rooftops outside, Daniel finished stacking boxes near the back storage area when he noticed Frank watching him from the office doorway. You worked around engines before? Frank asked. Daniel wiped grease from his hands with an old rag. Long time ago. Mostly truck maintenance. During delivery routes. Frank nodded toward an old pickup sitting inside the nearest bay. Starter cable is loose. Think you remember enough to help. For a brief second, anxiety tightened inside Daniel's chest. Failure used to follow him everywhere, and even small tasks now carried the fear of proving everyone right about him. But Scout walked over quietly and sat beside the truck as if waiting patiently for Daniel to continue. Daniel exhaled slowly before crouching beside the engine. The familiar smell of metal, oil, and warm machinery brought back memories buried deep beneath years of exhaustion. Muscle memory returned little by little as his rough hands adjusted tools, checked the cable connections, and tightened the loose mount beneath the hood. 10 minutes later, the engine turned over smoothly. Frank crossed his arms with a faint smile. Still got it. Daniel stared at the running engine while something complicated shifted inside him. Pride. Not the loud kind people bragged about. Something quieter. The kind a man feels when he realizes he is not completely broken after all. That evening, after the garage closed, Daniel sat outside on the curb beside Scout while the winter sky darkened above the mountains. The cold air smelled like pine trees and distant chimney smoke. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the small stack of bills Frank had paid him earlier that afternoon. Enough for food. Enough maybe for a cheap motel room if he saved another week or two. Enough to start imagining tomorrow again. Scout rested his head across Daniel's knee while headlights drifted past on the road ahead. Daniel scratched gently behind the shepherd's ears and looked toward the glowing lights of town in the distance. You know what scares me the most? He asked quietly. Not losing everything. I already survived that. He paused for a moment, staring at the fading sunset across the snow-covered hills. What scares me is thinking maybe I still have a chance to fix some of it. Scout lifted his head slightly at the sound of Daniel's voice, calm amber eyes watching him beneath the fading Arizona sky. And for the first time in years, Daniel Mercer allowed himself to wonder what his daughter Emma would think if she saw him trying again. 3 weeks passed before Daniel Mercer finally gathered enough courage to walk into the small grocery store pharmacy near downtown Flagstaff and buy a prepaid cell phone with part of the money he had saved from working at the garage. The box felt strangely heavy in his hands while he stood near the checkout counter beside Scout, who sat patiently against the soda cooler watching people move through the store. Daniel had spent years avoiding anything that connected him back to the life he abandoned. No phone calls, no social media, no forwarding address. Every unanswered message from his daughter had slowly become another reminder of the man he failed to be. Yet lately those memories no longer felt like chains pulling him downward. They felt like unfinished roads waiting somewhere ahead of him. Outside the store, the evening air carried the sharp scent of snow and pine trees while headlights reflected across wet pavement from the previous night's storm. Daniel sat on a bench beside the sidewalk and opened the phone box slowly, staring at the blank screen after powering it on. His hands trembled slightly. Scout rested beside his boots, calm and steady as always. "I do not even know if she still has the same number," Daniel admitted quietly. The German shepherd looked up at him without moving. Daniel swallowed hard and opened the contacts menu with stiff fingers. He still remembered Emma's number by heart. Funny how some things stayed burned into a man no matter how many years passed. He entered the digits slowly, staring at the final number for several seconds before pressing call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Daniel's chest tightened harder with every second until suddenly panic overwhelmed him and he ended the call before anyone answered. He lowered the phone immediately and covered his face with one hand while cold wind swept through the street. "Coward," he whispered to himself. For a long moment, he simply sat there listening to traffic pass through town while shame crawled quietly back into his thoughts. Maybe too much time had passed. Maybe Emma no longer wanted to hear from him. Maybe the kindest thing he could do now was stay gone. Scout suddenly placed one paw gently against Daniel's knee. The simple touch pulled him back from the spiral forming inside his head. Daniel looked down at the shepherd and let out a slow breath. "You really do not quit on people, do you?" Before he could talk himself out of it again, the phone vibrated in his hand. Incoming call. Emma Mercer. Daniel froze completely. For a second, he could not breathe. The screen glowed against the darkening Arizona evening while memories crashed through him all at once. Emma at 10 years old learning how to ride a bike. Emma graduating high school in a blue cap and gown. Emma crying quietly during their final argument before he disappeared from her life almost 3 years earlier. The phone continued ringing in his shaking hand. Scout remained pressed beside him, warm and silent beneath the falling snowflakes drifting softly through the streetlights overhead. Finally, Daniel answered. "Hello." His voice barely came out above a whisper. Silence filled the line for 2 long seconds before a woman's voice spoke softly from hundreds of miles away. Older now, stronger, but unmistakably hers. "Dad." Daniel closed his eyes immediately as emotion hit him harder than anything he had faced during the past few years. Traffic moved around him. Snow fell quietly across the sidewalks. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed through the cold mountain air. Yet in that moment, none of it mattered because for the first time in nearly 3 years, Daniel Mercer heard his daughter's voice again. And beside him, the German shepherd stayed perfectly still, as though he had known all along this was the road they were walking toward together. Daniel Mercer held the phone tightly against his ear while snow drifted across the quiet sidewalk outside the grocery store. And for several seconds, neither he nor Emma spoke again. The silence between them carried years inside it. Missed birthdays. Unanswered calls. Long nights where both of them probably wondered whether the other still cared enough to try. Daniel could hear faint city traffic through the phone on her end, mixed with the distant sound of a television somewhere in the background. "I thought you were dead," Emma finally whispered. The words struck him harder than anger ever could have. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the wet pavement, while Scout stayed pressed quietly against his leg beneath the cold streetlight. "I know," he answered softly. "I am sorry." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He had rehearsed 100 different explanations in his head over the years, but now that he finally heard his daughter's voice again, none of them mattered anymore. There was no excuse big enough to erase the pain he caused by disappearing. Emma took a shaky breath on the other end of the line. I called hospitals, shelters. I even hired someone online once to try finding you. Daniel closed his eyes tightly. Every sentence felt like another reminder of how far he had fallen from the father he once promised to be. I did not know how to come back, he admitted quietly. At first I thought I just needed time to fix things. Then the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to call. Snowflakes melted slowly against the sleeve of his jacket while cars passed through the intersection nearby. Emma stayed silent for several moments before speaking again. Where are you now? Daniel looked down at Scout beside him. The shepherd stared calmly toward the road ahead, as if guarding the moment itself. Flagstaff, Arizona, Daniel answered. I found some work at a repair shop. He hesitated briefly before adding, and I met a dog. To his surprise, Emma laughed softly through the phone. It was small and emotional and tired, but hearing her laugh again nearly broke something inside him. A dog, she asked. Daniel nodded, even though she could not see him. German Shepherd. His name is Scout. You named him? Yeah. Another quiet pause followed. This one felt different somehow. Less sharp. Less distant. Emma finally spoke again, her voice gentler now. You used to say you would never own another dog after Max chewed through your favorite work boots. Daniel smiled, despite himself, as old memories returned clearly. Those boots cost me $200. And you still let him sleep on the couch every night. Daniel looked toward Scout again and slowly scratched behind the shepherd's ears. Guess some habits stay with you. For the next several minutes they talked carefully, awkwardly, like two people trying to rebuild a bridge one plank at a time across a canyon neither of them fully understood anymore. Emma told him she was living in Colorado Springs now and working as a physical therapist. Daniel listened quietly, overwhelmed by how much life had continued moving forward without him there to see it. Yet beneath the sadness, another feeling slowly appeared too. Gratitude. Because despite everything, Emma had still answered the phone. Before hanging up, her voice softened again. Dad, yeah, I am still angry. Daniel swallowed hard. You have every right to be. But I am glad you called. Tears filled Daniel's eyes immediately, and he turned away from the street so nobody passing by would notice. Scout moved closer beside him without a sound while cold Arizona wind carried snow through the glowing lights above the empty sidewalk. Me too, Daniel whispered. After the call ended, Daniel remained standing there for a long time staring at the dark phone screen in his trembling hand while emotion moved through him in waves too heavy for words. Then he slowly looked down at the German shepherd beside him and shook his head with quiet disbelief. You really did save me. Did you know that? Scout simply sat beside him beneath the falling snow, steady and loyal as always, while somewhere far beyond the mountains ahead, a broken family quietly began finding its way back toward each other. Winter settled fully over northern Arizona during the following month, but for Daniel Mercer the cold no longer felt endless the way it once had. Every morning he woke before sunrise inside the small room Frank Walker rented to him above the repair shop office, and every morning Scout waited beside the door ready for their walk through the frozen streets toward the diner for coffee before work. The room was tiny, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a worn dresser, and the old blanket Daniel had carried through the hardest months of his life, yet to him it felt more valuable than any apartment he had ever rented before, because it represented something he thought he had lost forever. Stability. Routine. A reason to keep moving forward. The mechanics at Walker Auto Repair had slowly stopped treating him like temporary help and started relying on him more each week. Daniel now handled oil changes, brake inspections, and basic repairs alongside the younger workers who once assumed he was just another drifter passing through town. Sometimes he caught himself giving advice without even realizing it, explaining engine problems from memory while the younger mechanics listened carefully. Each time it happened, part of him still felt surprised that people respected his knowledge again. But the biggest change came every Sunday evening when Emma called. At first their conversation stayed careful and short, both of them avoiding painful memories buried beneath the surface. Yet week by week the distance between them slowly softened. Emma told him stories about patients at the rehabilitation clinic where she worked in Colorado Springs. Daniel told her about the garage, the snowstorms rolling through Flagstaff, and Scout becoming unofficial shop security after barking at delivery drivers who approached too quickly. Hearing his daughter laugh again became something Daniel quietly carried through the rest of each week, like warmth stored against the cold. One evening after work, Daniel sat outside the garage beside Scout watching snow fall beneath the yellow parking lot lights when Frank stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Daniel before leaning against the railing nearby. "You look different these days," Frank said. Daniel frowned slightly. "Different how?" Frank shrugged. "Like somebody finally convinced you to come back to life." Daniel looked down at the steaming coffee in his hands while Scout rested across his boots. For a long moment, he did not answer. Then he glanced toward the shepherd beside him. "Honestly," he admitted quietly, "I think it started with him." Frank smiled faintly. "Funny thing about dogs. They see people for who they are before the rest of the world catches up." Snow drifted silently across the empty road beyond the garage while Daniel thought about those words. Maybe Frank was right. Before Scout appeared beside the highway outside the diner, Daniel had stopped seeing value in himself completely. Survival became the only goal. One more night. One more morning. But Scout had looked at him differently from the very beginning. Not like a broken man or a failure or someone too far gone to matter anymore. Just a man worth staying beside. Daniel reached down and rubbed the shepherd gently behind the ears. Scout lifted his head immediately, calm amber eyes reflecting the parking lot lights. "You know," Daniel said softly, "I still do not understand why you picked me." The German shepherd simply leaned closer against his leg while snow continued falling around them in the quiet Arizona night. And as Daniel sat there listening to the distant sound of traffic moving across Interstate 40, he realized something important. Sometimes life does not repair itself through grand miracles or dramatic moments. Sometimes healing begins with one living thing refusing to walk away from another when the entire world already has. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while Daniel Mercer was replacing brake pads inside the garage, and Scout slept near the office heater beside a stack of tires. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof outside as warmer weather finally began pushing winter out of northern Arizona. Daniel wiped grease from his hands when his prepaid phone buzzed inside his jacket pocket. And the moment he saw Emma's name on the screen, something inside him still tightened with nervousness the same way it had every week since reconnecting with her. Not because he feared hearing from her, but because part of him still struggled to believe he deserved another chance at being her father again. "Hey, sweetheart," he answered carefully. Emma sounded unusually excited. "Dad, I have a conference in Phoenix next weekend for work." Daniel leaned lightly against the tool cabinet while mechanics moved around him in the background. "That is good, Emma. Phoenix is only a couple hours from Flagstaff," she continued softly. "I was thinking maybe I could drive up after the conference." Daniel's breath caught immediately. Across the garage, Scout lifted his head as if sensing the sudden shift in emotion. "You mean visit?" Daniel asked quietly. "If you want me to." For a moment, Daniel could not answer. The thought of seeing his daughter in person after nearly 3 years felt almost too large for him to hold. He suddenly became aware of every mistake he had made, every birthday missed, every voicemail left unanswered while his life collapsed piece by piece. What if she looked at him and only saw failure? What if rebuilding things over the phone had been easier because distance softened the damage? Scout slowly stood and walked over beside him, resting calmly against his leg. Daniel closed his eyes briefly before speaking. "I would like that very much." Emma exhaled softly through the phone, and he realized she had been nervous too. "Okay," she whispered. "Then I will come Saturday morning." After the call ended, Daniel remained standing there staring at the dark phone screen while his thoughts raced faster than he could organize them. Frank eventually noticed the expression on his face and walked over. "Everything all right?" Daniel nodded slowly. "My daughter is coming to visit." Frank broke into a grin immediately. "Well, that explains why you suddenly look like a man about to pass out." Even Daniel laughed quietly at that. But beneath the humor, fear lingered heavily inside him through the rest of the week. He cleaned the tiny room above the garage 3 separate times, even though it barely contained anything besides his bed, a chair, and folded work clothes. He bought fresh coffee for the first time in months. He even borrowed a proper winter jacket from Frank because his old denim coat still carried too many memories from the worst period of his life. Through all of it, Scout stayed close beside him, watching calmly while Daniel prepared for a reunion he never truly believed would happen. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright beneath a clear Arizona sky. Daniel stood outside the garage long before Emma's car was due to arrive, hands shoved nervously into his borrowed jacket pockets while Scout sat beside him near the curb. Every passing vehicle made his heartbeat quicken. Then finally a silver SUV turned slowly into the lot and parked beside the garage entrance. For one frozen second, Daniel could not move at all. The driver door opened, and Emma stepped out into the cold mountain sunlight wearing a dark blue coat and jeans, her long blonde hair moving gently in the wind. Older now, stronger, but unmistakably the little girl he used to carry on his shoulders during summer fairs in Denver. Daniel felt emotion hit him so suddenly he nearly lost his balance. Emma stared at him too, eyes filling immediately as years of distance collapsed into a single silent moment between them. Beside Daniel, Scout remained perfectly still, watching quietly while a father and daughter prepared to see each other again for the first time in almost 3 years. For a long moment, neither Daniel Mercer nor his daughter moved beside the garage in the cold Arizona sunlight. The years between them seemed too large to cross all at once. Emma stood beside her SUV with tears already filling her eyes while Daniel remained frozen near the curb, afraid that one wrong step might somehow shatter the fragile second chance standing in front of him. Then Emma smiled through the emotion, small and trembling but real, and suddenly Daniel saw flashes of the little girl she used to be hidden inside the woman standing there now. Without thinking anymore, he walked toward her. Emma met him halfway across the parking lot, and when they finally embraced, Daniel felt something inside himself break open completely. He held his daughter carefully, almost cautiously at first, as though he still could not believe she was truly there. But Emma wrapped both arms tightly around him and did not let go. Daniel closed his eyes while tears slipped quietly into his beard. The cold wind moved softly around them, carrying the distant sound of traffic along Interstate 40. But for the first time in years, the loneliness that had followed him across every highway and sleepless night finally loosened its grip. "I missed you so much, Dad," Emma whispered against his shoulder. Daniel swallowed hard before answering. "I missed you every single day." When they finally stepped back, Emma wiped tears from her face and laughed softly through the emotion. "You look better than I expected." Daniel shook his head with a faint smile. "That bad, huh? You scared me for a while there." Before Daniel could answer, Scout slowly walked forward beside them. Emma immediately looked down at the German shepherd with surprise. "So this is Scout." The shepherd sat calmly in front of her, studying her carefully with intelligent amber eyes. Emma crouched slowly and held out her hand, and after only a brief pause, Scout gently pressed his nose against her palm. "Oh my God," Emma whispered softly while scratching behind his ears. "He is beautiful." Daniel watched the interaction quietly, emotion tightening in his chest again. "He found me outside a gas station during a snowstorm," he explained. Emma glanced up at him with a knowing expression. "Sounds more like he rescued you." Daniel looked down at Scout and smiled. "Yeah, I think he did." They spent the afternoon together walking through downtown Flagstaff beneath clear winter skies, while Daniel showed her the diner, the garage, and even the small storage shed where he and Scout survived their first freezing night together. Emma listened carefully to every story, sometimes laughing, sometimes growing quiet when she realized how close her father had come to disappearing completely. Yet through all of it, she never looked ashamed of him. She looked proud that he had fought his way back. As sunset painted the mountains deep shades of orange and gold, the three of them sat together outside the garage, sharing takeout burgers and hot coffee, while Scout rested peacefully at their feet. Emma leaned against her father's shoulder the same way she used to years ago during long road trips through Colorado, and Daniel realized something important then. Healing did not erase the past. It did not magically remove regret or loneliness or the scars left behind by hard years. Healing simply meant deciding that the future deserved a chance to. The cold wind drifted softly through the parking lot, while evening lights slowly flickered on across Flagstaff, and Daniel looked down at Scout beside him before, resting one hand gently across the shepherd's thick fur. Months earlier, he had believed the world no longer noticed men like him. Broken men, forgotten men. But sitting there beside his daughter and the dog who refused to leave him behind, Daniel finally understood something different. Sometimes all it takes to save a life is one loyal soul willing to stay beside you long enough to remind you that you are still worth finding.